Recently, Virgil Texas and Brianna Joy Gray trolled left-wing Twitter. They claimed that their debate with professor and linguist Noam Chomsky exposed how America's most preeminent dissident was behind the times, out of touch, and incoherent. The podcaster Virgil Texas wrote, "Me and Breby Joy argued with Noam Chomsky for an hour on the latest episode of Bad Faith Pod. We won the argument.
Now we have a simple question. Do you want your grandchildren to survive?" I think the people you're talking to say, yes, I want my grandchildren to survive.
So many people's grandchildren are already not surviving.
Yes,
That's the issue.
Do you want to ensure that they'll live underwater or have a chance to survive?
So many people aren't thinking about living underwater because they're incarcerated or they're unhomed.
Then as an activist, your goal is to get them to think about it, because that is what is at stake.
He followed this tweet with more bragging. To everyone mad about this, yes, Chomsky is an old man, but anarchists periodically need to be put in their place so people don't start thinking they have rational views. Now, I'm not an anarchist, but when presented with Chomsky's harm reduction argument against Brianna's special pleading, that is her argument that the suffering of the few justifies pressing a button marked Doomsday for All, the winner is obvious, and it isn't the Bad Faith crew. But what's most depressing is that this is what is offered up for us to consider at all. This pseudo-debate where nobody's premises can be questioned and wherein optics are more important than understanding only makes the struggle for socialism more difficult. Luckily, the Bad Faith approach is not the only one available. In order to find a better option, a better argument, we should probably start by testing the usual claims from climate change activists. The organization 350.org's Manifesto includes these lines. For more than 20 years, governments have been meeting, yet greenhouse gas emissions have not decreased, and the climate keeps changing. The forces of inertia and obstruction prevail, even as scientific warnings become ever more dire. This is true, but a bit misleading. In fact, what has happened over the last 2 decades can be seen here in this graph. Over the last actually 30 years, the so-called advanced economies have managed to stop the growth of CO2 emissions. That is, they haven't reduced their output of carbon, but these countries have managed to continue to grow their economies without a corresponding increase in greenhouse gases. The developing world, on the other hand, has more than doubled its output of carbon. Simultaneous with this increase in pollution, there has been an increase in life expectancy throughout the developing world. In China, for instance, the average life expectancy is now 76, while in 1990, the average Chinese citizen would live to be 66. The good effect of economic development globally doesn't overcome the consequences of unchecked carbon emissions. Further, the more developed nations have both the economic and technological ability to do more to mitigate the looming disaster. What is stopping both the developing nations and the developed world from effectively responding to the problem of rising temperatures and climate change brought on by emissions is not only the ideology of the right wing. Instead, the true culprit is the logic of our economic system. Capitalism demands a certain kind of growth based on the expansion of abstract labor. Fully demonstrating that climate change can't be adequately addressed within a capitalist system is not the aim of this video, but what is certain is that changing the foundational system that determines our social outcomes could make combating climate change much easier. What's less clear is why there is no left that can clearly articulate that aim. Hello, Zero Books readers and viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. And in this video, I'm going to show you my Rubik's Cube. And then we're going to continue examining Corneilius Castoriadis' book, The Imaginary Institution of Society. The goal here is to demonstrate that the turn away from Marxism was a mistake. I know that that's, may seem like the deck is stacked here, but I'm doing my best to give Corneilius Castoriadis a fair reading. I want to figure out why it is that someone who was a committed Marxist in the 40s, someone who was aligned with the Forrest Johnson tendency, which I agree with, would end up turning away from Marxism altogether later on in the 60s and 70s, and why it is that overall, even Marxists today tend to shy away from understanding Marx's critique of political economy as being central to the Marxist project. So that's what we're going to be examining. The Bad Faith podcast comes into this because I feel as though we're stuck in a very surface level kind of approach to politics, to radical politics, partly due to the fact that we don't have any recourse to the critique of political economy. We don't have any way to even imagine overturning or fundamentally transforming the base of society. And without that, we end up trying to figure out how to control the Democratic Party, or what to do with labor in the UK, or how to come up with the right kinds of reforms that can make the capitalist society we're dealing with more humane. What we're dealing with now is a struggle to create capitalism with a human face. And I just don't think that's adequate. But look, I did solve it. If you enjoy these videos, you should click on the subscribe button and hit that bell. Even better, you should support us on Patreon. Patreon supporters get access to our Parrot Room, or private podcast conversations, as well as to podcasts about Rosa Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution, Gilles Dauvé's From Crisis to Communization, and Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. Support us on Patreon and join us in learning critical theory with the aim of changing society. When I consider the debate between Chomsky and the Bad Faith podcasters as a single moment, when I take it in as an aesthetic object, it has the same eerie quality as a scene from the old ITV series Sapphire and Steel, the scene that Mark Fisher used at the beginning of his book, Ghosts of My Life. Fisher quotes from the final episode. "This is the trap. This is nowhere, and it's forever."
This is the future, isn't it?
The most famous line from Karl Marx's 11 Theses on Feuerbach reads as follows: "Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." Taken on its own, it seems to be an injunction to act without thinking or without understanding. However, in the context of the whole piece, the meaning is very different. For instance, here's the very first thesis. "The main defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the object, actuality, sensuousness, are conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, not as a human sensuous activity, or not subjectively. Hence, it happened that the active side, in opposition to materialism, was developed by idealism, but only abstractly, since, of course, idealism does not know real sensuous activity as such." Both Chomsky and the Bad Faith podcasters make the same mistake as Feuerbach. They take American politics as an object, as a material fact that can be addressed practically by either voting for or not voting for Biden. But they do not grasp that the true aim is to change the object. Chomsky argues that by voting for Biden, the left will be able to survive long enough in order to participate in the kind of activism that will change the Democratic Party. The Bad Faith podcasters argue that by refusing to support Biden, the left will use a stick and punish the party, and thereby move it to change itself in order to regain the left's support. What neither Chomsky nor the Bad Faith podcasters can envision is a way to change the conditions that support the Democratic Party. What neither bothered to debate is how the left itself should alter itself in order to be able to change the material reality they find themselves stuck in. Both sides are stuck in an eternal present, a moment wherein the idea of a future, the idea of a different base of society, is elusive or perhaps even erased. But we shouldn't blame Chomsky or the podcasters from bad faith for this failure. The left hasn't had a materialist approach to politics for a long, long time. Marx's critique of political economy has been relegated to the academy or to tiny sectarian groups since at least the 1960s. Now, this month I've been exploring the ideas of the post-Marxist Corneilius Castoriadis in order to discover the thought process and arguments that convinced a one-time member of a very Marxist sectarian group called Facing Reality, a one-time ally to the Forrest Johnson tendency to break with Marx. In the previous videos on Corneilius Castoriadis, I argued that the one-time radical Marxist had turned away from Marx's critique of political economy due partially to his embrace of the false notion that state monopolies could permanently overcome the contradictions that Marx claimed were endemic to the capitalist mode of life, and that the consequence of this rejection was a conception of capitalism as a transhistorical reality. Instead of a material analysis of society, Castoriadis turned to ideology critique. What I want to take up now is Castoriadis' philosophical reason for rejecting Marx. In his book, The Imaginary Institution of Society, Castoriadis spurned the critique of political economy because he rejected Marx's rationalism. Marx's claim to be able to understand the categories of capitalist production and exchange, to be able to trace out the consequences of these contradictions, struck Castoriadis as an act of totalitarian hubris. Even worse, he saw that Marx's claim that changes in the material base of society could lead to radical social change to be just an assertion. In order to see history this way, Marxists had to resort to merely imposing meaning onto events retroactively. For example, Castoriadis asks us how it could be that the contradictions in capitalist society determined the success or failure of the Russian Revolution, when the event hinged upon so many contingencies. If it weren't for a train trip from Zurich to St. Petersburg, for the decision of a few German officials to allow for Lenin's safe passage, the Russian Revolution wouldn't have come off. If it weren't for the weak character of Nicholas, the autocracy would never have toppled. Neither event seem in any way connected to the generalized operation of capitalist production or the development of capitalist relations. They are instead just particular, seemingly random and isolated events. As Castoriadis says, claiming, as Hegel did, that history has a cunning and that a universal spirit operates through the individual and subjective acts of particular characters is, according to Castoriadis, only an assertion and a mystification. In order to understand the difficulty in philosophical terms, we can think of the 17th century Dutch philosopher Baruch de Spinoza. Spinoza's pantheistic philosophical argument made a case for the equivalence of nature and God. He wrote that, "In nature there is nothing contingent, but all things have been determined by the necessity of a divine nature." And yet his systematic examination of God's modalities and his ethics included an explanation of the finite and contingent aspects of existence. He claimed that everything that is follows from the divine nature of God, and that what was finite could not be produced or follow from an eternal and infinite God. This parallels the difficulty of the universal spirit in Hegel as opposed to the contingent and particular acts of individuals. However, while Spinoza appears to have unintentionally created a gap between God and the world, Hegel's arguments on universal and particular qualities incorporate the gap between the two aspects of being. The gap is according to Hegel, the absolute universal quality. I'll try to explain this a bit more clearly. When we consider an object in the world, for instance a Rubik's Cube, we're confronted with both universal and particular qualities at the same time. We are encountering both the universal notion of the cube and the particular sensuous qualities of a particular cube. If we look at colored stickers, we find both the individual red and green and blue squares on the surface of the toy, and we also discovered the idea of color and of redness or of greenness. Particular and the universal in the Rubik's Cube are not identical with one another, but they are entangled, even as they remain distinct. There could be no particular red sticker without a concept of redness, and conversely, there could be no concept of redness without at least a few particular objects that could be perceived to be red. To clarify this even a bit more, there was apparently a time when the color blue did not exist. Analysis of Homer's The Odyssey finds that the color did not appear in the text, but instead objects and landscapes were described as black or white. There were occasional appearances of red and green. In fact, it was not until various blue dyes were introduced, a process that apparently took some time and was somewhat uneven, that the color blue became a nearly universally recognized color.
Is a blue frit that was added. Now, this is the only photograph that I could find, and when I contacted the Museum of Fine Arts, they said that they were actually actively looking at this to be able to determine whether this was the first blue frit that was actually used. If it is indeed ends up being the case that this is Egyptian blue pigment, it's before there is even a word for blue, which means that the entire material discovery of it is intimately related to the intellectual adventure that man has in terms of trying to figure out what is the word, what is the material, how do I relate to that, and how do we move forward in terms of material design.
Returning to Castoriadis, in his book he advocates for the significance of the symbolic and the imaginary as against the rational and/or functional approach of Marxists. He insists that specifically the imaginary aspects of life are those that bridge the gap between the functional aim of ceremonies, religions, and other cultural practices, and the symbolic meanings that are instituted by society. For example, the idea that Nike shoes symbolize athletic prowess and perhaps a kind of disciplined and heroic approach to the world and society emerges not only out of the functional qualities of the shoes, but also out of the images and meanings created by advertisers. It is neither the rationality of the economic aims of Nike nor the utility of their sneakers that drives sales, but rather the imaginary meaning of the swoosh. It is at this point that Castoriadis most clearly goes wrong, however, as he too cleanly separates the imaginary, or the ideological, from the functional and economic. What is more significant than the momentary meaning that might arise from an advertisement featuring William Burroughs and a shoe is a more fundamental imaginary meaning that drives and determines the value of the sneaker. Changing the symbolic meaning of a consumer item, shifting from one fantasy to another, is not sufficient if our aim is radical transformation. Rather, we should instead aim to understand what is functional is always also imaginary, just as what is particular is always also universal. Castoriadis wrote that Marx understood the significance of the imaginary as he understood the significance of the fetishized commodity. He wrote, Marx obviously went beyond a purely economic view and recognized the role of the imaginary. But for Marx, there is no purely economic realm. There is only the way that we imagine and institute economic relations and the rational consequences of our own imaginings. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.